In Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the character of Ivan famously declares that if God does not exist, then nothing is forbidden. This is a reflection of a very common position held by some theists and, increasingly, some atheists, who say that God's existence is necessary for the continued function of human morality. In turn, this claim has been mocked by many non-believers who say that if your morality is sustained by a belief in a supernatural God, then you aren't really a good person at all. However, underlying this discussion is a whole host of confusions, because the claim that, without God, we cannot have morality has been put forward in a number of ways, ranging from outright ridiculous to terrifyingly plausible. Together, they raise exciting questions about how we can do ethics in an atheistic and empirical philosophy. And these are worth exploring, whether you are a staunch believer in the divine or an atheist of many years. Get ready to learn how atheist ethics tend to differ from the religious, how God might not grant us morality after all, and much, much more. To lay my cards on the table here, I am personally an agnostic, very much leaning towards atheism, so bear that bias in mind when you're watching the video. And as always, this is just a taste of the wider philosophical debate around this topic, and I do encourage you to look into it for yourselves if you're interested. But without further ado, let's get started. 1. Atheists are bad people. The first version of this argument is probably the weakest, and it asserts that an atheist is either by definition a bad person or more likely to be a bad person than a religious person. On some people's religious viewpoint, the statement an atheist is by definition a bad person makes a certain sort of sense. If faith in God is interpreted as an ultimate moral good, and his favour is the judge of whether or not we are good people, then sure, an atheist would be a bad person in this framework, purely by the definitions of the words involved. However, this also defines good and bad in an explicitly faith-based manner, and so is unlikely to be a criticism that really wounds the atheist. It essentially makes unbelief the definition of bad and then says the atheist must be bad. There is nothing logically wrong with this. You can define terms by stipulation however you like, but it does make the argument sort of trivial. Importantly, it does not imply that an atheist is a bad person in the way that most people tend to mean, that is, exhibiting increased levels of antisocial behaviour or properties. The other way of looking at this argument is as an empirical one, suggesting that atheists are, as a matter of fact, less moral than their religious counterparts. This would amount to a claim that atheists commit antisocial behaviour more often. There is a kind of logic to this idea. After all, if I truly believed that my actions were always known by the ultimate judge of the universe, then it makes sense that I might keep a closer eye on what I'm up to. And if the stakes of morality are eternal damnation or eternal salvation, then this is a pretty strong incentive to behave ourselves. And even now, many people report trusting the religious over non-believers. However, the actual data is pretty unclear here.
So, while editing, I did stumble across a recent meta-analysis which does show a slight positive relationship between pro-sociality and religious belief. However, the authors of the meta-analysis heavily urge us not to draw sweeping conclusions from this. I just thought it was worth mentioning.
There are differences in the way that atheists and religious people tend to frame morality. Atheists have a tendency to be prone to consequentialist ethical reasoning, whereas religious people tend to favour social cohesion. I've linked some studies in the description in case you want to explore this further. I also want to emphasise that these studies are just looking at averages. Individual people will, of course, differ wildly in their ethical frameworks. My point is that empirically it has not been demonstrated that atheists are in any way less moral than religious people, if we define morality as pro-social behaviour. At most, the data is inconclusive. This also makes sense when you account for the huge variety of theistic beliefs and how different believers emphasise different aspects of their theology. A die-hard believer in the prosperity gospel is likely to behave very differently to a Benedictine monk. Various sets of religious and non-religious belief can lead to different behaviours, and it's certainly too hasty to suggest that a non-religious person is more likely to be antisocial than a religious person. If that is true, it is yet to be consistently demonstrated. A variant on this argument that I've heard theists make is that religion is pragmatically good for social cohesion. That is, if a whole group of people adhere to the same core set of religious beliefs, then that group of people may get along much better. This, again, has a certain surface-level logic to it, though technically it is not an argument that religious societies are preferable to non-religious ones, but that societies with homogeneous belief systems are preferable to heterogeneous ones. I have had a look at the academic literature here, and ultimately, while there has been some sociological investigation into this question, it is incredibly difficult to separate the religiosity quality of a society from other relevant factors. For instance, I've seen some people point out that Scandinavian countries have very low crime rates and are much less religious than a lot of other nations. However, they are also comparatively rich countries with relatively low poverty rates, and both of these would lead us to expect lower crime rates in the first place. There is a wider sociological question to be asked about the role religious centres have historically had in promoting community trust or in general community building. However, this issue is not so much to do with religious belief in a society, but instead how religious institutions fulfil important social functions. At least in principle, an atheist society could reconstruct the positive aspects of these roles. My point is, it is one thing to say that religious institutions can have positive roles in a community that we might find difficult to replace. But it is another thing entirely to say that an atheistic society is undesirable simply due to its atheism. The first seems plausible, and I think it highlights an important potential task that we could begin to undertake in our increasingly secular societies. Whereas the second seems much more tenuous. At the very least, I haven't found consistent evidence to suggest it is true. I also want to remind everyone here that I'm not an expert in sociology, and this is not in any way an in-depth analysis of the area. So treat my view here with the requisite skepticism. And if I've made any mistakes, please point them out, because there will be corrections in the pinned comment. It is also unclear to what extent the benefits of religious centres are due specifically to their religious nature, as we also see positive psychosocial effects from non-religious gatherings like scout camping trips. But separate from this complex debate about the sociological effects of religiosity in a society, one thing is clear. The claim that atheists are, by the very nature of their unbelief, less moral than religious people does not hold water. If it is interpreted as a definitional claim, then it is tautological but ultimately also trivial. And if it is interpreted as an empirical claim, then it is unevidenced. At least currently. There may be a paper that comes out tomorrow that blows all of this out the water. However, while this argument certainly had its day, and there is evidence to show that people harbour this implicit prejudice against atheists, I very rarely hear this made explicitly anymore. It's much more common to hear people say something like objective morality depends upon God, and so without God we will no longer have objective morality. And this is just what we shall look at next. But first, a word from our very kind sponsors, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform where you can take various classes on everything from video editing to creative writing to card tricks. Since the last time I spoke about Skillshare, I have finished the class I was taking on classical music history, and am now retaking Ali Abdal's class on how to type quicker. Typing scripts is a huge part of my job, so this is really helpful for me. I genuinely get a lot of value from Skillshare. They are fantastic both for developing my professional skills like video editing, but also just for having something to watch where I actually learn something new rather than doom scrolling on social media or staring at the ceiling having a brief but potent existential crisis. If you've been around the channel a while, you'll know I'm a bit of a curiosity nut. I enjoy learning about a whole range of disparate topics, and Skillshare is perfect for this. The first 500 people to use my link will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so take advantage. Click the link and have a go. And thank you, my wonderful viewer, for watching this interlude the whole way through. 2. Morality needs God. Now, this section is going to get a little bit technical, so I'm going to start by defining some key philosophical terms. The first is moral realism. This is the idea that moral statements are objectively true or false, and at least some of them are true. So, for a moral realist, the statement murder is wrong is true or false, just in the same way that the earth is flat is false, or my desk is wooden is true. This is a meta-ethical position. It is defending the possibility that moral statements even can be true or false. For our purposes, a moral anti-realist is anyone that disagrees with this position. Anti-realists come in all shapes and sizes. Some believe that all moral statements are false, but others think that moral statements should not be seen as truth at all, but instead as expressions of emotion or power. Put a pin in this idea, as we're going to come back to it later. A relatively common claim by some theists is that without God, moral realism becomes untenable. This is often expressed as a biconditional. Moral realism is true if and only if God exists. So if God exists, then moral realism is true, and if moral realism is true, then God also exists. In the context of some religions, this makes a lot of sense. For some religious people, God's will and goodness are co-referential. So if God wills something, he thereby makes it good. On this framework, it is not that murder is wrong is true and God recognized this and decided to let us know. It is that murder is wrong because God has willed it to be wrong, and his will is the very definition of perfection. With this definition of good, the biconditional actually makes an awful lot of sense. If goodness is God's will, then no God, no goodness. And by contrast, if there is a God and he has a will, then we also get goodness. However, Outside of this particular definition, the biconditional becomes a lot less obviously true. For instance, John Stuart Mill famously defined goodness as that which produced the greatest amount of pleasure. If we adopted this conception of morality, then the biconditional fails, since pleasure exists independently of God. And so atheists could adopt this and have objective goodness without religion. Problem solved. However, all is not well, problem not solved, because there are truly immense philosophical difficulties in establishing an objective definition of goodness in this way. For example, G.E. Moore puts forward his open question argument, where he says that these naturalistic definitions of morality cannot truly define good, since we can always ask the question, but is this really goodness? So when John Stuart Mill argues for his utilitarian conception of morality, it is perfectly sensible for us to ask, yeah, but is the greatest pleasure really good? But we cannot do this with true definitions. When I say that a triangle is a three-sided shape, it makes no sense to ask, but is that three-sided shape really a triangle? Yes, it is. That is just what it means to define a triangle. Moore's contention is that this open question argument will apply to any naturalistic definition of objective goodness, and that as a result, objective goodness cannot be found in the natural world. Moore inferred from this that when we say goodness, we must mean something in addition to these facts about the world. There is some special quality that our moral ascriptions have that cannot simply be inferred from descriptive facts. This is one way of looking at the famous is-ought gap, the philosophical problem that whatever facts we put forward about the external world, they never amount to telling us how things should be. I could know all of the truths about human happiness, well-being, physics, neuroscience, culture, sociology, and more, and yet still be unable to deduce how things ought to be without assuming some basic moral principle at the outset. And if I attempted this, I would be committing the naturalistic fallacy. As it is traditionally presented, the theist does not have this problem, because God does the work of both being descriptive and prescriptive. He exists and he dictates moral laws for the universe, along with the physical ones. You see examples of this all over the place in theistic writings. For instance, St. Augustine talks about worldly goodness as a reflection of God, and C.S. Lewis explores how goodness is grounded in the character of God. But there is a question worth asking here. Does God's existence actually get around the is-ought gap? After all, it seems the aspect of God doing the work of establishing morality here is the fact that God is good. But arguably, this is introducing the ought aspect into the existence of God at the beginning. It is that one of God's properties is defining morality. This raises the question of whether we have actually gained philosophical territory here, or whether defining morality in the mind of God falls into the same category as defining morality along utilitarian lines or as serving one's community. That is, as a first-principled assumption that any atheist or theist could make. Sure, I agree that having an omnipotent moral legislator provides strong motivation to abide by his law, but that doesn't establish the further question of whether his law is just. Another way to look at this problem is to use Plato's famous Euthyphro dilemma. Here, Plato asks us that if goodness aligns with God's will, is this because God's will is definitionally good, or because God's will is according to a higher moral law? If it is the former, then it follows that if God wished something we would consider evil, say a massacre, then we should follow him. Whereas the latter admits that God is not grounding morality at all, but simply reporting on some higher moral basis. And then we have the question of what grounds that. Either way, it becomes sensible to ask whether God's will is really good. Now, there are lots of ways that theologians have attempted to solve this issue, and I can't go into them all. One is by arguing that God's will is necessary and immutable, and as a result, he could not change moral law, but is still the source of it. Another is by biting the bullet and saying that if God somehow did change his mind on what was right or wrong, then we should follow him. But whatever you think of that dilemma, one final and vital point here is that just because God could ground morality, it does not follow that without God there can be no objective morality. These are separate statements corresponding to the two halves of the biconditional. It could be that God is one amongst many types of objects that could ground morality. So in order for the theist to say that God is necessary for morality, that is, without God you do not get any morality, they have to show that an atheist worldview precludes any further objective definition of goodness. This type of argument is incredibly interesting, and it is just what we shall look at next. 3. The Atheist's Conundrum. So far, we have looked at two separate claims, that atheists are less moral than believers and that we need God to ground objective morality. However, I think that both of these are potentially weaker reflections of a much more interesting argument. And it is one that many atheists have put forward as well, that we can use exactly the same sort of reasoning we employed to reject the existence of God to reject the existence of objective morals, and that this raises a potentially quite serious philosophical problem. People are atheists for all sorts of reasons, but in my experience, atheism commonly stems from a philosophical outlook that I will call naturalistic empiricism. That is, someone observes the world and they ask if any part of it requires the existence of the divine or the supernatural. When they conclude that it does not, they reject the existence of God for lack of evidence, and often reach the further conclusion that the only real properties are natural properties. Short of direct revelation, how could there be empirical evidence that would force us to believe that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing and all-loving agential being out there? Thus, they conclude that the existence of God is unverified by the available evidence, and so they withhold their belief. It's worth noting that some theists also agree with this point. They just reaffirm the importance of faith in response to it. However, we can apply exactly the same sort of empirical reasoning with regard to our moral ascriptions. Assuming a broad correspondence theory of truth, when I say my desk is made of wood, I know what it would take for that statement to be true. There is something called my desk, and it holds the property of being wooden. Furthermore, this property of woodenness is verifiable. I can conduct a test to see if it is made of wood or some other material. But what kind of empirical evidence could support the truth of the statement murder is wrong? As J.L. Mackie famously argued, this property of wrongness feels rather strange from an empirical perspective. If I went to the scene of a crime, where would I find the wrongness? I would find the murder weapon potentially, and even the murderer, but where would I find the immorality? If it is just that people would tell me it was wrong, then would murder continue to be wrong if everyone stopped calling it wrong? How would we tell if there'd been some change in what was morally right? What evidence would reveal itself to us? It seems that if objective moral properties existed, then they would be importantly different to regular properties in that they would be totally unobservable. But then, if we are good empiricists, should this not lead us to disbelieving in them for exactly the same reason that we disbelieved in God? Both the statement God exists and morality exists, interpreted objectively, are not verifiable, so shouldn't we suspend our judgment? Otherwise, we're simply being inconsistent. We are applying an epistemic principle to God's existence and then rejecting it in the case of morality. The two philosophers who are emblematic of this approach are David Hume and A.J. Ayer. They both rejected the existence of God for roughly the same reason. They did not see any evidence for him. But they also conceded that the same logic would lead to them rejecting moral realism. And I think this is the strongest tension between atheism and objective morality, that the same underlying epistemic approach that led us to rejecting God would also lead us to rejecting the objective truth of moral ascriptions. So it is not that atheism implies moral anti-realism, it is just that they are both suggested from the same starting point. Now, I want to caveat this with a few things. First is that there are some atheists who are simply not empiricists in this way, in which case the argument does not follow. There are also some arguments for maintaining moral realism in spite of a generally empirical approach. I don't want to deal with these arguments in this video or we will be here all day, but I do want to acknowledge their existence. It also does not necessarily follow from rejecting moral realism that morality becomes unenforceable or that anything goes. We could appeal to the idea that whether or not a moral system is objective, it is in almost everyone's subjective interests to follow it and to enforce it upon others. This would trade in a metaphysical justification for a practical one. We could also argue that without a moral system, we would find it much more difficult to coordinate behavior and so adopt a sort of two-level style of thinking, where we accept moral anti-realism in the seminar room but ignore it when we are out in the world. To riff on Voltaire's famous saying, if morality does not exist, it might be necessary to invent it. Furthermore, we can see that this argument actually targets far more than simple atheism. It suggests an incompatibility between empiricism itself and moral realism. So if we want objective morality, this argument suggests we reject the idea of observation as the sole means of learning about the world. It is not that moral anti-realism follows from atheism, but rather from a certain interpretation of empiricism. This is importantly different from saying atheists cannot have objective morality. It's instead that the same reasoning that would lead one to atheism would also lead one to rejecting objective morality. And this argument about the limits of empiricism ranges far wider than just philosophy of religion. It branches into epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of science, and so much more. I don't have the space to go into it now, but I've linked an article in the description for anyone who's interested. But finally, I want to highlight an important and fascinating question that I think us non-believers might be interested in tackling. 4. Post-Theistic Morality. For the sake of argument, let's say we accept that final position that naturalistic empiricism implies that we cannot have objective morality. Clearly, the next question is, where do we go from here? Well, there are a few different options. The first is to reject morality altogether, so we throw any potential moral system out the window and refuse them as reasons for acting. I think that most people don't really want to do this unless they're very angry or very scared, but it is a philosophical option. The second is to attempt to recapture objective morality using some naturalistic principle compatible with empiricism. This will inevitably encounter the difficulty of the open question argument we saw earlier. But that argument in turn has seen some criticism in recent years, so perhaps there is still room to bridge the is-ought gap. I'm not personally optimistic, but hey hum, that doesn't mean it can't happen. But failing these two routes, we have a pretty exciting task ahead of us. How do we construct an acceptable philosophical picture of morality that is consistent with our epistemic principles? What would naturalistic moral philosophy look like, and how would it differ from moral realist philosophy? Remember, this is not just a question of moral psychology, but how to make sense of morality across all spheres of study. Here are a few simple ways this has been attempted, just to whet your appetite. We could have an intersubjective or cultural story of morality. This is where we can have moral statements that are true and false within a given community using the standards of that community as truth makers. A good way of thinking about this is to use the analogy of language. If I start using the word horse to refer to dogs, then I have made a mistake in English. But if every English speaker started doing this, it would no longer be a mistake. It would simply be how English is spoken. Thus, what is a mistake in language is intersubjective. Applying this to morality has its own drawbacks in the form of cultural relativism. If morality is judged relative to the standards of a society, it is unclear how we can justify judging another society by our own moral standards. And we might want to do this in the case of a totalitarian government or a brutally racist regime or a village who's decided to kick puppies for fun. Another perspective would be to try to come up with a moral system that almost everyone would agree to from their own subjective preferences, and then using that to practically keep your moral system going, while rejecting its subjective truth. So whereas before a utilitarian might argue that because everyone strives for happiness, it is the ultimate good and we should maximize the gross happiness of the world, under this view it would instead be a pragmatic argument along the lines of, if we all want to be happy, then we should follow this system, and they would hope that this motivated people to be utilitarians. This would arguably rescue some stability in our morality if we could truly find a system that almost everyone would agree to, but that is notoriously difficult. It is very much an open question whether there is something that everyone wants that is specific enough to build a functioning moral system around, and how we could dissuade people from simply seeking out their own self-benefit and to hell with everyone else. Alternatively, we could analyze moral statements as if they are outbursts of emotions. So if I say murder is wrong, I'm really just expressing an extreme emotional distaste for murder. This has certain benefits in that it accounts for just how motivating moral beliefs can be. But as a view, it also requires some further tweaking. For instance, our moral statements have a certain logical structure which our emotions tend not to have. It makes sense to say, if stealing is wrong, then hiring thieves to steal is also wrong, and then to use this statement in deductions. But on a traditional analysis, this logical structure depends on these statements being about actions and assigning genuine properties to those actions, not them being simple emotional outbursts. Hooray and boo do not have a propositional structure to them. I obviously cannot solve this debate, I've barely scratched the surface, and I've also presented simplified versions of these views here. But my overall point is this. If we are naturalistic empiricists, and if this is the foundation for our atheism, then arguably objective morality is truly under threat. From here, we have choices. We can give up morality, we can defend its objectivity, or we can provide an alternative philosophical account of it. Moreover, each of these options come with their own philosophical and practical trade-offs that we must bear in mind if we're to be intellectually consistent. If we fall into some form of relativism, then this often suggests giving up on condemning other communities for not following our moral systems. If we say morality rests on shared consent and a social contract, then we also have to set the boundaries for that morality to where the consent ends. If we are emotivists, then this suggests we should treat moral statements as if they are truly emotional outbursts, and consider what this means for reasoned moral argumentation and moral persuasion in general. I am not suggesting that atheists cannot have morals or that atheism implies a form of moral nihilism. It is rather that many of us are naturalistic empiricists on paper sheets and moral spiritualists in messy streets. And if we want to be intellectually consistent, then it's worth confronting this problem head on. If not, then we are leaving our philosophy half done, and we have missed the opportunity for some truly exciting thinking. And I think that would be a real shame. If you want more thoughts on the role religion plays on this more pragmatic level, then click here where I look at the theistic arguments of none other than Jordan Peterson. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.